of infrastructure. The fact is you cannot have big league quality of life with little league infrastructure. And my colleague has made the point that repatriation would be a natural as one of the two bookends for infrastructure. It would ensure that we could have some funds we could count on, some publicly available funds, and I think it would be a natural fit with the kind of bonding that I and Senator Hoeven and others have been interested in. So I'm here to talk on another subject, but before he leaves, I wanted to thank my colleague for his comments. Mr. President and colleagues, it is fair to say this is Throwback Thursday here in the United States Senate, and it is also a big day for the Treasury Secretary, Steve Mnuchin, not only because we are dealing with taxes, not because there is another glamorous photo shoot with a big sheet of dollar bills. This is also the one-year anniversary of what has come to be known as the Mnuchin Rule. It was November 30th, 2016, when news broke that Mr. Mnuchin was the likely nominee to head the Department of Treasury. And that morning, the Secretary-to-be went on TV and delivered what sounded like a very sweet promise. Here's what he said about the Trump administration's ideas for the issue we talk about tonight, tax reform. And I'm going to quote Steve Mnuchin directly. He said, "Any reductions we have in upper income taxes will be offset by less deductions, so there will be no absolute tax cut for the upper class." Now, in case anybody missed that last part of his statement, he said, no absolute tax cut for the upper class. And he didn't stop there. He went even further in hyping big plans he had. He said, and I'll quote, "When we work with Congress and we go through this, it'll be very clear. This is a middle-income tax cut." This is all as part of the anniversary to kind of refresh everybody's memory. And after that pledge, I talked about this matter with Mr. Mnuchin in the Senate Finance Committee. And he smiled. He was thrilled that I was recalling this pledge he made. And when I brought it up, I said, well, we could just call this the Mnuchin Rule. And Mr. Mnuchin at that time thanked me, and he said, and I quote, "There would be great esteem of having the Mnuchin Rule with both the buffer rule and the Volcker Rule." And he said, "I take that as a great compliment." So here we are, a year later, and what a difference a year has made. The Mnuchin Rule is now a broken promise for the history books. This week, Republicans scrambled to pass a tax plan that reaches into the pockets of working people in the middle class and showers trillions of dollars in handouts to multinational corporations, high flyers, the politically connected. And I think it's also important to remember the Mnuchin Rule was just one part of the sales pitch. Now there's a whole lot more to the con job. Republicans have said time and again that the tax cuts would pay for themselves. Time and time again, we heard about the unicorns. We heard about the growth fairies. The magical growth will be so powerful that new revenue is going to come pouring pouring in, and the tax cuts are going to be fully paid for. Now, in addition to that, I think it's important to recognize this on this special anniversary. The Secretary went even further. He said the tax cuts wouldn't just pay for their $1.4 trillion cost. They would bring in, on top of the $1.4 trillion, an additional $1 trillion. Well, today, after pushing and making sure that we could get it before we actually had the key final votes, we were pleased to receive from the independent referees on taxation, the Joint Committee on Taxation, the official dynamic scoring analysis that they did of the Republicans' plan. And let's be clear, folks, now that we've heard from the independent tax umpires, we can say officially the magical growth fantasy is over. And I say that, Mr. President, also in the context of bipartisanship. Because I said in the course of writing the two bipartisan bills that I authored, first with Senator Gregg, second with Senator Coates, I said I happen to believe that behavior matters. I believe a good bipartisan tax reform bill will generate some revenue. And the Congressional Budget Office agreed with me. But it is not going to be fantasy land type growth. And the reality is, after Mr. Mnuchin said what was going to happen is the Republican plan would pay for the $1.4 trillion cost and generate another $1 trillion on top of it. What we now know, as a result of what I was sent today, the Republican tax plan, even with dynamic growth factored in, actually loses more than $1 trillion. And there's other bad news on top of it. The Republican tax plan, according to the Joint Committee on Taxation, slows down economic growth after 2025. So you put a kibosh on two major selling points that we heard about month after month after month from Republicans in selling this plan. The tax cuts don't pay for themselves, and there's no new wave of growth headed our way. The party of Reagan is on a mad dash to run up the deficit by $1 trillion, slow down the economy, and raise taxes on more than half of the middle class. And the only analysis Republicans can get to back up their tax plan is either cooked up by the in-house staff at 1600 Pennsylvania or is based on revenue-neutral tax bills that don't even exist. By the way, more news a year into Mr. Mnuchin's work, the Secretary promised a comprehensive analysis from the Treasury Department that would prove his claims, prove that there would be more growth, more jobs, red, white, and blue opportunities for our people. The tax cuts would pay for themselves, or as he said, would generate much more revenue than that. And the Secretary of Treasury promised us that. He promised us that repeatedly, that we would get that analysis of what this bill would do for growth and jobs and improving the quality of life for our people. But let me tell you, that was another broken promise. Yet one more in a chain of broken promises over the months, and a particularly important one, because the Treasury Secretary made some especially surprising projections, and in effect, we asked him to back them up. He said he would, and now we know that not only is he not going to do it, apparently he had no intention to ever do it. Based on the news that broke this morning, as far as I can tell, Secretary Mnuchin never even asked his department to do the comprehensive analysis of the bill that he promised. On top of that, his Treasury Department buried a recent paper that showed that the overwhelming beneficiaries of corporate tax cuts aren't workers, they're shareholders. They said it didn't agree with the department's current thinking. Let me be clear. I think it sounds like another part of the cover-up at the Treasury Department. Colleagues, a year ago, Secretary Mnuchin told the American people there will be no absolute tax cut for the upper class. It'll be very clear. This is a middle-income tax cut. Then he said the tax cuts wouldn't just pay for themselves. $1 trillion new dollars of federal revenue would come pouring in. Not a single word of that has turned out to be true. The Mnuchin rule is the most expensive lie since George W. Bush stood on an aircraft carrier and said the mission in Iraq was accomplished. And the idea that these tax cuts pay for themselves isn't just a little off the mark. It is a $1 trillion misfire. What we have here is a con job on the middle class, and Secretary Mnuchin and his allies have covered it up every single step of the way. My Democratic colleagues and I have said over and over again, we've said we agree the tax code is broken. We share the view of our colleagues that there ought to be an opportunity for a bipartisan bill, and as I have done every single time I've spoken on this subject, Mr. President, I've made it clear that it doesn't have to be this way. Beginning of the week, I joined 17 moderate Democratic senators. Senator Donnelly said it very well. I mean, really an outpouring of enthusiasm for taking a bipartisan approach to really doing tax reform right. And a bipartisan approach, Mr. President, is not just some kind of pie-in-the-sky happy talk. Bipartisanship is what gets you the certainty and the predictability you need to grow private sector jobs that are good paying and are driven by innovation. And I know it can be done. I'm glad to see the President of the Senate here tonight is from the state of Indiana. One of the two bipartisan bills that I wrote was with one of his former colleagues, Senator Dan Coates, who is not just a very well-liked member, but somebody who believes deeply in sensible economic policy, and he was on the Finance Committee. And we worked on this for a substantial amount of time. And you know what? It's not easy to write a bipartisan tax reform bill. You have to have some give and take. Senator Bradley would fly all over the country to work with Republicans to try to find common ground. Right now, we can't get people to even walk down the corridor to help put together a proposal. So it didn't have to be this way. We had opportunities for bipartisanship, and it's something I feel very strongly about because I spent literally hundreds of hours with two very fine, very conservative Republican senators in order to put together two actual bills, bills with bill numbers, bills that were proposed in the United States Senate. But what a difference between that approach and what we have seen from Secretary Mnuchin. Not a single effort, not one, from Secretary Mnuchin to talk specifics about what it would take to get a bipartisan approach. And then we had, as I've noted tonight, these promises of making sure the focus would be on the middle class, making sure it would generate additional revenue. It's been a trail of broken promises when it could have been an opportunity to bring everybody together and give everybody the opportunity to get ahead. Well, one of my very favorite phrases, Mr. President, is from the late Israeli diplomat Abi Wyden, who said, "The Americans always get it right." And he paused and said, "after they've tried everything else." Well, my hope is that Secretary Mnuchin will see the error of his ways, see why the policies I've described aren't right for the American people, see why it's important for the administration to change course and push for what Democrats here have called for, a bipartisan approach, which our moderates eloquently spoke to this week, which we have bills that can help guide us. And I hope that we can, in the future, break with the kinds of policies I've had to describe on the one-year anniversary of the Mnuchin rule and decide that we're going to change course, have a tax policy that focuses on the middle class, puts money in their pockets, gives everybody a chance to get ahead, and that the Secretary will recognize that his claims that what the Republican tax bill is all about are not borne out by the facts. Mr. President, I yield the floor.
President.
The Senator for Alaska.
Mr. President, I ask unanimous consent that it be in order for Senator Nelson and Senator Baldwin or their designee to each offer a motion to commit, which are at the desk, and that no amendments to the instruction be in order. I further ask consent that following leader remarks on Friday, December 1st, there be up to 20 minutes of debate on each motion, equally divided in the usual form, and that following the use or yielding back of that time, the Senate vote on the motions with no intervening action or debate.
Is there objection? Without objection.
Mr. President.
The Senator for Wisconsin.
I have a motion to commit at the desk.
The clerk will report the motion.
The Senator from Wisconsin, Ms. Baldwin, moves to commit the bill H.R. 1 to the Committee on Finance of the Senate with instructions to report the same back to the Senate in 3 days, not counting any day on which the Senate is not in session, with changes that 1, are within the jurisdiction of such committee, and 2, support the President's plan to close the carried interest loophole.
I ask unanimous consent to call up a motion to commit at the desk.
The clerk will report the motion.
The Senator from Oregon, Mr. Wyden, for Mr. Nelson, moves to commit the bill H.R. 1 to the Committee on Finance with instructions to report the same back to the Senate in 3 days, not counting any day on which the Senate is not in session, with changes that 1, are within the jurisdiction of such committee, and 2, provide permanent tax relief for middle-class Americans in a deficit-neutral way.
The Senator from South Carolina.
Thank you, Mr. President. Mr. President, I have had the privilege of sitting on the floor and listening to